Billionaire Ray Dalio explains how the New World Order unfolds. Now, all the big news has been recently focused on the rapidly evolving geopolitical events unfolding all around the world as our current world order looks set to change. From Russia and China both abandoning the petrodollar system to the invasion of Ukraine, things have never changed so fast, at least not in our lifetimes. So considering all of this, there couldn't be a better time to break down and analyze a recent video put together by Ray Dalio, which is a summary of his recent fantastic book titled The Changing World Order that I've been reading. Now, if you don't know who Ray Dalio is, he's a billionaire who manages the largest and the most successful hedge fund in the world. So when he talks, people listen. And so far, his video discussing the rapidly changing world order has received over 9 million views on YouTube. Now, this book looks back at the past 500 years of history and analyzes what causes the dominant empires like the Dutch, the British, and now the American Empire to rise and fall. So in this video, I'm going to break down all of this for you, as well as I'm going to apply some of my own analysis and thoughts onto the brilliant work that Ray Dalio has already done, because I do see something slightly different than he does. So let's go. All right, welcome back. If you're new to the channel, my name is Mark Moss, and I make these videos to change the way you think about money because almost everything you've learned is wrong. Of course, if you've taken 15 hours to read this book, maybe you're on the right path, but I'm going to make it simple and easy for you to understand like I always do. Now, I do want to let you know, as I've been letting you know recently, that if you really want to understand these things better, you got to learn from people like Ray Dalio. This is a time hack. I mean, he's taken his whole life, his whole team. He spends millions, tens of millions of dollars on research, and he's distilled it down into something you can read in about 15 hours. And I'm going to distill it down into just 20 minutes. One of the best ways to do that is to learn from other people, which is why I'm holding the Market Disruptors Live.com event. I'm bringing 15 of the top speakers in the world: Luke Grumman, George Gammon, Daniel DiMartino Booth, Harry Dent, of course myself, Robert Breedlove, and so many others, experts who can compress that time for you, tell you what they think is going to happen, most likely happen over the next couple of years, and what you should be doing about it. Come hang out with me, the speakers, have dinner with us. There's a chance to have dinner with us, make new friends, new community, and learn like never before. There's never been a time to pour into your own education as right now, because it's never been more critical. All right, that being said, jumping back into the summary of the book. Now, like I said, I highly recommend that you read the whole book, or even go back and watch the 45-minute video that he did breaking all this down, his whole thesis. But for those of you operating on a time constraint and you want to compress that time, well, I've got you covered with the short summary, okay? Now, the overall 30-second summary of Dalio's thesis is that we're about to witness an event that none of us have witnessed in our entire lifetimes, right? We've reached the end of an 80-year long-term debt cycle, and the economic system needs to be reset. Sounds familiar, right? Now, throughout history, when the global reserve currency reaches the conclusion of the 80-year long-term debt cycle, an 80-year financial revolution cycle that I've been talking about, a change in the global reserve currency status normally occurs. Now, throughout history, the rising superpower challenges the power of a declining empire, and this challenge has normally coincided with a military conflict. That's right, a war. Now, Dalio says that the world is currently going through this process right now, and he frames the US as the declining global superpower and China as the rising power preparing to challenge the United States. Now, that was a high-level summary. That was a high-level summary of his book. Now, just because there's many similarities today with history doesn't mean we're destined for a world war again, although we're sitting on the brink of one right now. And I'm going to give my thoughts on this later, but first, let's break all this down and make sense of this changing world order. All right, so what is a world order and how do they change? Well, a world order is simply how countries around the world are ranked against each other based on their economic, their military power. And throughout the history of the world order is constantly evolving, it's constantly changing between what Dalio calls the rising empires and the declining empires. Now, these empires are naturally competing against each other for the global reserve status, the global reserve currency, and to become the world's dominant superpower. Now, in his book, Dalio studied the rise and decline of 10 great empires over the past 500 years. And he noticed a ton of similarities, as you might imagine, amongst all of these different great empires. And we're going to break this down a little bit later in the video. But first, He simplifies the book by looking at the rise and decline of the four largest empires over the last 500 years, which are the Dutch, the British, the American, and, as he claims, the rising Chinese empire, which it has been. Of course, I have my own thoughts on that and more about that at the end. He noticed how these empires go through these 250-year cycles of rise and decline. Of course, I call these 250-year revolution cycles. So regular viewers will notice that this is a cycle we've covered many times on this channel. The 250-year empire cycle, like I said, I call it the 250-year political revolution cycle. Now, one global power can't rise in power and wealth forever without running into certain challenges that end up leading to its own demise. So Ray Dalio explains how every empire over the past 500 years has gone through this rise and then subsequent decline, which he explains with this chart I have up on the screen, and he calls it the big cycle. So first you have the start. That's the New World Order. Then as this New World Order starts to take place, starts to take off, then you start to have peace, you have prosperity, you have productivity, and then this is the, hard times create strong men. And then you have the strong men creating great times, which this leads to productive capital and debt markets, which then leads to financial bubbles and growing wealth gaps. All right, this productivity and development of financial markets leads to the currency becoming a reserve currency. But then, because of humans, and humans having no restraint, then it leads to overstretching financial busts and economic downturns, which then leads to the government printing lots of money. You guessed it, you're witnessing it right now, which of course leads to more financial booms and busts, which then of course leads to war, and then you guessed it, a new world order. And the whole process starts all over again, another cycle. Now, what's most interesting about history is that a declining global superpower is normally met with a challenge from a rising superpower, as we've talked about, and it challenges it as it's declining. And the smaller rising competitor recognizes the current superpower is becoming complacent, they're abusing their power, and they're in a period of decline, and they're reaching what Ray Dalio calls the top of their empire cycle. When the rising power sees this, they decide to seize the opportunity, strike while the iron's hot, so to speak, to take over control by striking at the opportune time. Now, Ray Dalio says there's three crucial indicators that he watches which suggest a potential change is on the horizon for the current monetary order. The government of the global superpower can't pay its debt, and with interest rates at zero, their central bank begins printing money. Sounds familiar. Number two, large wealth inequality causes an internal political division inside the dominant country. Check, sounds familiar. And three, a rising external superpower begins to overtake the current global superpower. Now, Ray Dalio explains when this deadly sequence emerges, there's a change in the global reserve currency status and, of course, the external world order. He also explains that these changes often catch people off guard because they come around so rarely that we've never seen this event that we're about to witness, not in our lifetime. All right, now take a look around the world today. Do these events sound familiar to what we're seeing? I mean, yes, the US is heavily indebted and has created 80% of all new dollars in the last 2 years. China is rapidly rising, and Russia is denouncing the current world order after rejecting the US dollar reserve currency, and people all around the world are more divided than ever before, especially inside the United States with the red and the blue political divide. And we're going to talk about this more in detail shortly, but when we discuss the state of our current world order and the clown world, we'll call it that we're living in. All right. Now, something interesting that Ray observed and discusses that when these transitions unfold and the rising and declining powers clash, then war unfolds. Now, this is highlighted by the shaded 10 to 20 year sections on the chart that you can see up on the screen right now. All right. Now, this part is important to understand because of how it relates to the global reserve currency status and how this tends to change during these conflicts. The average length of each global reserve currency over the past 500 years has been around 100 years in length, and it tends to change every 80 to 100 years on average. Now, the global reserve currency has also changed in these periods where two empires clash and the rising empire takes power away from the declining empire. Ray Dalio tells us that we're currently living through one of these monumental transitional periods right now, today. And our world order is about to dramatically change. Okay, so now that we've gone through a little background on how a global order works and how they change, you might be asking yourself, so based off of that, Mark, just tell me, where are we in this current cycle? Well, I'm glad you asked. Per Ray Dalio, our current world order was established in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference, which many of you, at least my regular viewers, you should be well aware of by now. I talk about that all the time. The U.S. claimed the global reserve currency status at that conference due to its superior military, economic, strategic position and over the rest of the world. The U.S. held over 2/3 of the world's gold at that time, and it also accounted for around about 40% of global GDP, so it made some sense that it would become the global reserve currency. When this Bretton Woods Agreement went into place, it completely reorganized the global world order, and it placed the US as the dominant power for the 20th century. Holding the reserve currency is a powerful tool to yield for any dominant superpower. It's called the exorbitant privilege for a very good reason. But throughout history, countries will choose to store their excess savings in reserve currency because it makes international trading easier, and also because the reserve nation tends to have the deepest and the most liquid capital markets. Doesn't that sound familiar? Now, even despite the recent moves by countries to get away from the dollar, it still accounts for about 50% of international trade, despite only representing today about 20% of global GDP. And because of this, the world's also been borrowing massive amounts of US dollar debt. But again, as Ray Dalio points out, like all good things, this leads to excess and an eventual financial bubble that must come to an end. Now remember, those three metrics that we mentioned earlier that signal the end of one's empire reign? Well, money printing, low interest rates, internal conflicts, combined with a rising superpower. Well, Ray Dalio explains that the previous time in history that we went through this sequence of events was in the late 30s to 1945 era. And of course, at that time, the entire world order was reorganized. Now, I've done a lot of research, done a lot of presentations on how this pendulum is swinging back and forth and how it's about to swing back towards decentralization. And Ray Dalio, he sees the same thing. As the institutions we've grown to trust that were erected in the 1940s at the previous monetary reorganization have begun to decay. They've become corrupt, right? We've seen this. But before we analyze how this is all going to unfold, it's important to look at what makes a great empire. Okay, so first, Ray Dalio measures and analyzes an empire's relative strength against another empire using 8 key metrics, and they are education, technology and innovation, trade and competitiveness, economic output, trade, military size, financial center, and reserve currency status. Think about this. So if we have education and we teach people right, and they have good ideas and they can think for themselves and they're creative, then they can have ingenuity. That ingenuity, those ideas can create new products or services. Wealth is always products and services, and when we create more products and services, we export more. When we export more, then we're importing more money. As we make more money, we have better financial markets. As we have better financial markets, we need a military to protect that. Do you see how all of this works to each other? All right, that's why those 8 key metrics are important. So those are the eight key metrics anyway. So you can see, like I said, the path or the arc that they make through this empire. Okay, but if we dig deeper into this thesis and we break down the big cycle piece by piece, then we can see Ray Dalio breaks this down into this 250-year big cycle, and he breaks it down into 3 phases, which he calls the rise, the top, and the decline. Pretty simple, right? And he notes that all of the most successful empires, even China, which is a communist country, used capitalism to become global superpowers and to rise to the top of the global pecking order. Now, of course, you already know that capitalism is essential in building up the 8 key metrics that Dalio assesses that each country have. And China, adding this in and then rising fast further than anybody else, proves how true this is. So, for example, if we look back to the rise of the Dutch Empire, we can see that the Dutch were so advanced in technology that they invented 25% of all inventions in the world. The most important being ships, and of course pioneering the ideas of capitalism. They created the first publicly listed company called the Dutch East India Company. That was back in 1602. They also created the first stock market called the Amsterdam Stock Exchange back in 1612. And when countries around the world see this dominance in terms of trade and economic output, then they don't mind using the reserve currency because it makes international trade much more easy and frictionless, makes it easy and frictionless. Now, what I've talked about many times, and also Ray Dalio also thinks about as well here, is that the reserve currency, it's a powerful weapon to have, but it also comes with many unintended consequences. Now, this was highlighted by the Triffin's dilemma, and the basics of the Triffin's dilemma is that Robert Triffin believed that the dollar could not survive as the world's reserve currency without requiring the United States to run ever-growing deficits. Seems like he was right. But Ray Dalio claims that the reserve currencies always end in financial bubbles, as countries will take out debt in the reserve currency, and then these financial bubbles continue to grow when the empire was going through the rising phase. And while the financial bubble is growing, so does the wealth gap between the rich and the poor, and it's this growing wealth gap that helps to contribute to the internal conflict that begins to break out. And then we have decadence and wealth that the empire enjoys make it weak and overconfident, which then leads to, consuming and borrowing more than you produce because you get used to thinking that wealth and good times are privileges that you're going to have forever. But of course, reality always comes and seems to just, smack you in the face. It always comes to get you. And eventually, the cost it takes to maintain an empire grow larger than the revenue that it can bring in. Now, at these later stages, empires attempt to maintain their status through excessive borrowing, which only further weakens the empire's fiscal position. So, for example, the U.S. has spent over $9 trillion in setting up military bases in over 70 countries around the world in an attempt to protect the current world order. And just like the Roman Empire 1,000 years ago, the cost to maintain this empire becomes way too much. And once at the top of the big cycle, the financial bubble bursts, as the massive debt the empire took on becomes too much to manage. And this is when the global superpower either decides to default on its debt or to devalue its currency to pay back its debt. Either way. Now, when thinking about how your government goes bankrupt, it's gradually and then suddenly. All right, now we saw this play out perfectly in the case of the Dutch Empire with their reserve currency, the Dutch guilder, as they started to struggle to pay for the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War. And then we saw most of the devaluation to their currency occurred in a 5-year period between 1790 and 1795 as they devalued the guilder about 30% during that time. And it was the same thing with the British Empire. They struggled to pay for 2 world wars in the 20th century. And while the Great British Pound is still the longest lasting fiat currency in history, it lost its reserve status to the United States dollar, and it's been devalued by more than 95%. And again, history repeats. And today we can see the same thing happening again with the US empire. Same old, right? Too much debt and then a rapidly devaluing currency to pay down the debt. And these are not isolated incidents, all right? There's been over 700 currencies that have been devalued since the year 1700, which just proves that every paperback currency returns to its intrinsic value of 0, even reserve currencies. Now, speaking broadly, the US empire is in a period of decline, and Ray Dalio points out that he believes China is the rising empire based upon the 8 metrics that we talked about earlier. So the question begins, what will happen to the seemingly declining US empire? Will the US empire be able to hang on to the global reserve currency? Will the US continue to decline and meet the fate of every empire that was before them? Or will the U.S. be able to pivot and regain its greatness and escape the fate of the empires? Well, those are all good questions, but one thing I certainly agree with Ray Dalio is the position the U.S. is in relation to the converging economic, political, and technological cycles, which I did a 3-part video series on, which my amazing editor should be linking up here. There's a playlist of those 3 videos. Now, there's no doubt we're going through a revolution right now, right? There's millions of people in the streets protesting all around the world, resisting the current world order. We have wars breaking out. Trust has been destroyed. And while there's many similarities today to the history of rising and declining empires, there's also lots of differences that could impact the outcome of what comes next. Now, I do differ with Dalio when it comes to China, as I personally believe that they're facing many headwinds that many people either they don't see or they choose to ignore, such as their poor demographics, enormous debt burden, their dire energy and water crises, and those could be devastating for them. And oh yeah, don't forget, they also have communism. I mean, come on, right? You guys know how I feel about that. Communism and central planning has failed every time. 100% of the time, always. Now, this video is already getting pretty long for me to break all that down, but leave me a comment down below if you'd like me to do another video breaking all of this down, breaking down whether China can in fact be the next global superpower as Ray Dalio believes they are. But back to Dalio, he presents China as the rising power in his book, and like I said, also that great video, but without mentioning Bitcoin. Interesting. Now, finally, in January 2021, he did write a letter to his shareholders titled, quote, "What I Really Think of Bitcoin," and he called it, quote, "one hell of an invention," and he also disclosed that he actually owns some Bitcoin. And it's a glaring miss in his research is that technology is always what changes the world order. And by his omission of the world being on the brink of another 50-year technological revolution cycle, you have to look at this to understand what comes next. But again, like I said, this video has gone way too long, so leave me a comment if you want me to dig more into China or how his omission of technology is really missing out, because of course I care what you think. Hopefully you appreciate my condensed version, this time hack, if you will. Like I said, one of the best ways to hack, to shorten your time, is to read books like experts from Dalio or watch summaries like me, or even better, come to live events and meet people like Ray Dalio, George Gammon, Luke Grumman, Daniel DiMartino Booth, myself, of course, like I said, Harry Dent, Robert Breedlove, and so many more. MarketDisruptorsLive.com is coming up. Come meet me. I'm tired of talking to a camera all the time. I'd love to shake your hand. You can have dinner with me and the other speakers. It's an amazing time to make new friends, build a community, and so much more. I hope to see you there. And with that, like I always say, give me a thumbs up on this video if you like it. If you don't like the video, it's okay. Give me a thumbs down. But at least leave me a comment and let me know why. And that's what I got for you today, all right? To your success. I'm out.